A little over a month after Abraham Lincoln was sworn in on March 4th, 1861, the Confederate forces will fire on Fort Sumter off the coast of South Carolina, igniting what will become the bloodiest conflict in American military history. The American Civil War will consume the presidency of Abraham Lincoln and will age the Illinoisan in noticeable ways. In today's episode, we're going to discuss the wartime presidency of Abraham Lincoln and how it impacted the presidential election of 1864. Let's get started. Lincoln's military strategy was a cornerstone of his leadership. One of his critical strategies was the blockade of the South's expansive 3,500-mile shoreline, which included several major ports and nearly 200 inlets, bays, and rivers. At the beginning of the war, this seemed like a nearly impossible task for a nation that only had a handful of naval ships. However, by the war's end, Lincoln's administration had commissioned about 500 naval ships, with around 150 of those on patrol at any one time. The blockade wasn't just about numbers, it was about persistence and innovation. These ships were able to capture or destroy about 1,500 blockade runners. And while 5 out of 6 of these blockade runners were able to evade capture, which allowed Britain to dismiss this as a paper blockade not enforceable by international law, the primary goods that were getting out were luxury goods, small arms, and medicines, not the bulk cotton that the Confederacy was dependent upon for economic survival. In fact, during the war, the Confederacy was only able to export about 500,000 bales of cotton compared to the 10 million bales shipped out in the 3 years before the war. This blockade was also a major foreign policy issue. The Confederacy had hoped that nations like England, which were heavily dependent upon Southern cotton, would intervene. They even went so far as to cut off most of the cotton exports in 1861, hoping to force Britain's hand. Surprisingly, England took no official action to break the blockade despite the Confederacy's expectations. Strikingly, England even tolerated the Union seizure of British ships who were trading with the South and never officially recognized the Confederate States. Still, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that Britain and France wouldn't enter the conflict. In fact, both nations at various points came close to recognizing the Confederacy. It took the diplomatic skills of Charles Francis Adams, the U.S. minister to England and grandson to John Adams, to keep both nations at bay. A key turning point in these delicate international relations was when England declared its neutrality in the conflict. By doing so, they effectively recognized the Confederacy's belligerent status. This meant that the Confederacy could legally purchase arms and secure loans from neutral nations. And it even allowed the British shipyards to begin building blockade runners and warships for the South. Tensions reached a boiling point with the Trent Affair, where the Union Navy intercepted a British ship and seized 2 Confederate diplomats. England's Prime Minister Lord Palmerston was furious and demanded an apology, sending troops to Canada and halting shipments to the United States. Lincoln, recognizing the stakes, released the diplomats but avoided a public apology, diffusing a potential conflict. Throughout the war, British shipbuilders constructed numerous vessels for the Confederacy, including the CSS Alabama and Florida, which wreaked havoc on American merchant ships. In France, Napoleon III had his eyes on expanding influence in Mexico and even unofficially recognized the Confederacy. But despite these close calls, no European nation officially recognized the Confederate States, primarily because of economic, social, and diplomatic considerations. On the home front, Lincoln faced significant opposition, particularly from the Peace Democrats, who were increasingly vocal against his policies by 1862. Known as Copperheads, these dissenters were mainly old-line Democrats who opposed the Republican-led centralization of power in Washington. They were against the national banking system, new protective tariffs, the draft, martial law, and any move toward emancipation. The term Copperhead itself likely came from the practice of some Midwestern Democrats who wore copper pennies as a symbol of protest, while others suggest it compared them to the venomous snake. As dissent grew, Lincoln issued an executive order declaring that any citizen who discouraged enlistment or engaged in disloyal practices would be subject to martial law, effectively suspending the writ of habeas corpus. This is going to lead to the arrest of between 15 and 20,000 citizens, most of which were from the border states who were suspected of disloyalty. One of the most notorious Copperheads was Clement Vallandigham, an Ohio congressman. Arrested in 1863 for advocating for a negotiated peace and anti-war demonstrations, he was convicted by a military court and was sentenced to confinement for the war's duration. To avoid making him a martyr, Lincoln chose to banish him behind Confederate lines. Vallandigham later returned to the North and played a critical role in drafting the Democratic Party's peace platform in 1864. This incident highlighted significant questions about free speech rights and the use of military courts where civilian courts were operational. The very election of Abraham Lincoln was a catalyst for secession. Between his election in November and his inauguration in March of 1861, 7 states had already left the Union. They formed the Confederate States of America. They adopted their own constitution that enshrined states' rights and the perpetuity of slavery. They named Jefferson Davis, a Mississippi plantation owner, as their president, and Alexander Stephens, a moderate, as his vice president. Lincoln's response to secession was nuanced. He made it very clear that he did not intend to interfere with slavery where it already existed, but he would not allow it to expand into the new territories. He also made it clear that he intended to hold, occupy, and possess all government property, indicating that he would not allow the Union to be dissolved. This stance set the stage for the American Civil War when the Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in April of 1861. As the war raged on, it became evident that Lincoln would not back down. His military strategy, often called the Anaconda Plan, involved encircling the Confederacy and pressing relentlessly on multiple fronts. The Union armies, under generals like Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman, adopted aggressive tactics that aimed to destroy Confederate forces and resources, shortening the war and saving lives in the long run. Finding the right general was crucial. Lincoln fired many commanders who were either too hesitant or overly cautious, such as George McClellan, who, after winning the Battle of Antietam, failed to pursue the retreating Confederate army. It wasn't until Grant took command that Lincoln found a general who was willing to engage relentlessly and press the Union's numerical advantage to its fullest. Throughout the conflict, Lincoln's focus shifted toward total military victory above all else. Even as he focused on battlefield success, he tried to maintain the delicate balance of Union sympathies in the South. Although Lincoln refused to recognize the Confederacy's legitimacy officially, he treated captured Confederate soldiers as prisoners of war rather than traitors. This approach led to a prisoner exchange system that operated until 1863, when the Confederates declared that they would return captured black soldiers to slavery or they would execute them. Lincoln countered by threatening retaliation, and while the execution policy was abandoned, exchanges largely ceased after that. From the beginning, Lincoln's stance on slavery was cautious but resolute. He viewed slavery as a contradiction to the Declaration of Independence and as the primary threat to the Union. Yet initially, he stuck to his campaign promise that he would leave slavery where it already existed, primarily to retain the loyalty of the border states and the Northern Democrats. Yet as the war continued, pressure was mounting for a more decisive stance on slavery. Lincoln's initially going to propose a compensated emancipation program for the border states, which will be flatly rejected. The situation changed when thousands of slaves began fleeing to Union lines while others began acting rebelliously on plantations. By July 1862, Lincoln was ready to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which would free slaves in Confederate states still in rebellion. Following the Union victory at Antietam, he issued the preliminary proclamation, warning that the final one would come if the South did not surrender by July 1st of 1863. This shift was both a moral decision and a strategic one. This now aligned the war with the fight against slavery, which prevented European nations from siding with the Confederacy. Lincoln's concerns, however, with the legal status of this proclamation led to the push for the 13th Amendment, which would abolish the institution of slavery throughout the United States. Lincoln also knew that a second term would go a long ways towards solidifying and ensuring the end of slavery as a legal institution in this country. As Union victories mounted, Lincoln now faced the challenge of reconstructing the South. His initial policy, called the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction, offered pardons to most Southerners who pledged an oath of loyalty to the United States and accepted the abolition of slavery. Radical Republicans, however, saw this as far too lenient and wanted to see harsher measures. This clash came to a head with the Wade-Davis bill, which was proposed by Radical Republicans. The Wade-Davis bill is going to require the majority of white Southern men to not only take the oath of loyalty to the Union, but to take an ironclad oath that they never supported the Confederacy. Lincoln will pocket veto this bill, seeing it as too extreme and divisive. Lincoln's Reconstruction policy aimed for malice toward none and charity for all, as he famously stated in his second inaugural address. Yet his assassination in 1865 left the question of Reconstruction unanswered and plunged the nation into an even more contentious era of Reformation. Amidst the turmoil of the Civil War, President Lincoln pushed forward an ambitious legislative agenda that would shape the nation for generations. One such policy was the Homestead Act of 1862, a crucial part of Lincoln's vision for a more egalitarian America. Signed into law on May 20th, 1862, the Homestead Act was a fulfillment of a promise from the Republican platform in 1860. The Homestead Act granted 160 acres of public land to any adult citizen or intended citizen who led a family, paid a small registration fee, and agreed to live on the land for 5 years. Alternatively, settlers could own the land in as little as 6 months if they paid $1.25 per acre. While the act aimed to empower the poor by giving them nearly free land, in practice it benefited relatively few. Settlers needed resources to travel west, to clear the land, to sustain themselves until the first harvest, an investment that many could not afford. And so consequently, much of this land ended up in the hands of poor Midwestern and Eastern farmers who, after 5 years, sold the land to land speculators who were aligned with railroad interests. Despite these challenges, the Homestead Act laid the groundwork for the development of the Western territories, encouraging a wave of migration and settlement that would shape America's future. Complementing the Homestead Act was the Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862, another transformative piece of legislation signed by President Lincoln. Sponsored by Vermont Senator Justin Smith Morrill, this act provided states with large tracts of land to sell, using the proceeds to fund the establishment of colleges dedicated to agricultural and mechanical arts. The allocation was tied to each state's representation in Congress, 30,000 acres per senator and representative, resulting in 17 million acres of land distributed under the original act. This act not only demonstrated Lincoln's commitment to democratizing higher education, but it also helped establish the state university systems of the Midwest and the South. By mandating the inclusion of military science in these curricula, the Morrill Act also ensured that education would be aligned with national needs. As the Civil War raged on, Lincoln not only faced challenges on the battlefield, but within his own party. This war, which originally started as a fight to preserve the Union, had now shifted to a fight against slavery. And the Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued in September of 1862 and was enacted by January of 1863, added to the complexities of Lincoln's reelection bid in 1864. The election of 1864 was remarkable not just for its contentious nature, but for the simple fact that it happened. Despite the ongoing Civil War, the nation decides to proceed with its general election. This is an unprecedented decision in such times. Lincoln, however, did not feel confident that he was going to be victorious in 1864. A lot of this is due to the staunch opposition that he faces within his own party and with Northern Democrats. A significant faction of Lincoln's Republican Party, known as the Radical Republicans, was dissatisfied with his moderate stance on Reconstruction and his approach to emancipating the enslaved. They doubted Lincoln's commitment to ensuring full political equality for formerly enslaved people and opposed his lenient 10% plan for reorganizing Southern state governments. The radicals advocating for a more stringent Reconstruction plan pushed for the Wade-Davis bill, which we talked about earlier. Lincoln pocket vetoes, only deepening the divide between Lincoln and this faction of the Republican Party in the election of 1864. Despite these divisions, Lincoln is able to secure his party's nomination in 1864. However, there is a breakaway faction that will hold their own convention where they'll nominate John C. Fremont. And while Fremont's campaign will fail to gain any real traction, this dissent highlighted the political fragility of Lincoln's position. The more serious threat to Lincoln came from the Democratic Party, who will hold their convention in Chicago, Illinois in August of 1864. The Democrats will call the war a complete failure and will call for immediate peace negotiations. They will nominate General George B. McClellan, a former commander who was dismissed by Lincoln for his overly cautious tactics. However, McClellan is going to break from his party's stance when he says that he wants to preserve the Union, and I quote, at all hazards, causing confusion among the Democrats. The campaign was intensely bitter. Lincoln was vilified as a despot, a liar, a butcher. His critics will argue that he abused his powers as president, from suppressing press freedoms to using military law where civilian law was suffice. Democrats will also argue that Lincoln shifted the cause of the war from preserving the Union to making the war about ending the institution of slavery, a cause, they argue, most Northerners do not strongly support. Yet, Lincoln's campaign strategies and the political realities of the time favored him more than was initially apparent. His slogan, "Not changing horses midstream," resonated with the public, who was reluctant to change leadership in these uncertain times. The decision to replace Vice President Hannibal Hamlin with Andrew Johnson, a Southern Unionist, helped to attract the moderate Democrats from the border states. Meanwhile, the Republican platform's firm stance on punishing Confederate leaders, supporting the abolition of slavery, and aiding Union veterans helped to solidify the base. Two crucial victories, the capture of Mobile Bay by Admiral David Farragut and Atlanta by General William Tecumseh Sherman, shifted momentum in Lincoln's favor. These successes, along with the overwhelming support of soldiers who were allowed to vote by absentee ballot, secured Lincoln's re-election. On Election Day, Lincoln won the electoral votes of 22 states, losing only Delaware, Kentucky, and New Jersey. Following Lincoln's re-election, the tide of the war turned decisively in favor of the Union. On April 3, 1865, Lincoln entered Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy, only hours after President Jefferson Davis had fled. As Lincoln walked through the streets, African Americans hailed him as the Great Messiah, reflecting the symbolic importance of Lincoln to those who saw him as the liberator. Just days later, General Robert E. Lee, commanding a vastly outnumbered Confederate force, surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. Grant's generous terms allowed Confederate officers to keep their swords, a mark of respect for their valor, signifying a desire to heal the nation's wounds rather than deepen them. However, Lincoln would not live to see the full reconstruction of the Union. On April 14, 1865, while attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a well-known actor and Confederate sympathizer. Booth's action was part of a broader conspiracy to kill key members of the Union government. While Booth was killed days later in a dramatic shootout, his crime plunged the nation into mourning. Lincoln's death, as the war was coming to a close, muted the celebration of the Union victory. Thousands of Americans will line the streets of their town as Lincoln's body is carried by train back to Springfield, Illinois, to pay their last respects to the 16th President of the United States. Among the mourners was a future president, 7-year-old Teddy Roosevelt, who was watching from his family home in Manhattan. Lincoln's presidency during the American Civil War and his policies like the Homestead Act, the Morrill Land Grant Act, and his efforts towards Reconstruction made him one of the most impactful presidents in American history. His re-election in 1864 was not just a personal victory, but it ensured that the Union would pursue both victory and a new direction for a country in turmoil. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.